Hi everyone, just giving a little quick presentation about history of migration to Australia. So this one here is looking at, this graph is looking at migration to Australia. This one starts in 1894 and goes through until 2016. Now why 2016? Every 5 years Australia does what we call a census, where each household fills a document out explaining, they have to tick boxes and everything about who lives in the house, what incomes to the household are, what religion, what jobs people in the household have, all this sort of thing. And it gives the Australian government a snapshot about the Australian population. And they do it every 5 years. So the last census was in 2016. And at 2016, there were 28% of Australia's population were born overseas. Now, whether you knew that or not, I'm not sure, but yeah, I'm interested to see whether you think that's a lot or not. Obviously, before this period of time here, the first white settlers permanently came to Australia in 1788. Obviously, before that, Aboriginal people were living here for tens of thousands of years. And initially, there were more people migrating to Australia from Britain, but as time went on, more people were born here and started to outnumber the number of people who were migrating here. As you look here, World War I, moving back to Year 9, was 1914 to 1918, and then in 1919 we have the Spanish flu, so migration is going down. 1939 to 45 we have World War II. Now after World War II, so from 1945-46 onwards, you can see migration starts to steadily increase. And that's the period of time that we're going to look at over the next couple of weeks. All right. Now this graph here is looking at, again, from the census in 2016, the country of birth, where migrants come from as of 2016. Down here you can see 2006, 2011 and 2016. There's a comparison of those three census dates. All right. So you can see here the majority of our migrants come from the UK, then New Zealand, China, India, Philippines, Vietnam. Okay, now you've probably seen this map. All right, it's up in the wall on S2, and for those of you who can't remember the map, just want to show you this. Okay, so this is Aboriginal Australia before white fellas turned up. Okay, and this is quite a useful map. Works like you can go, obviously zoom in closer to see the names of the Aboriginal language groups. Okay, so a bit like Europe. All right, there's a diversity of languages and cultures there, and possibly it's estimated about 300 different languages, and then even more dialects. So that's Aboriginal Australia before white fellas turn up. First fleet turns up in first fleet turns up in 1788, and obviously they spread up. Western culture spreads throughout Australia. There's a big push here in the late 1840s with the Irish migration to Australia. So from 1845 to 1850, there's a big, what they call the potato blight or big famine in Ireland. Ireland was occupied by Britain or England at the time, and for a whole host of reasons, the whole Irish people went through a really difficult time. 25% of the population either died or left Ireland because of the famine. They call it Black 47, which 1847 was the worst year. So 1 million Irish people die of starvation, and 1 million Irish people migrate from Ireland. Some go to England, some go to the United States, and some come to Australia. And it's estimated that probably about 220,000 Irish people migrated to Australia in the mid to late 1800s. So they actually have quite a large influence on Australia's history. Also at the same time, or similar, we have in the 1850s, you have the gold rush, right, largely in Bendigo and Ballarat in Victoria. Again, there's massive migration from Europe. Some come from America to mine that gold rush. And a lot of them stay here in Australia, in Victoria, and some parts of New South Wales as well. All right. Then in 1901, we have federation occurs. So before 1901, South Australia, Victoria, Queensland, etc., they're all individual colonies with their own individual governments, and they were all answerable to the English Parliament. And so we used to, colonies used to trade with each other, and then as the 1880s go on into the 1890s, all the colonies start talking to each other and go, maybe it's a good idea if we actually all join together, and that's called federation, and a new country is created. Right, so Australia is created on the 1st of January 1901. Now, a couple of things happened here in terms of migration is that one of the very first acts of Parliament that the Australian Parliament creates is the Immigration Restriction Act. And you can't see this under here, but that says the White Australia policy. And basically, the Australian Parliament wanted to keep Australia white, and the Australian population basically wanted to stay white. So one of the very first laws that comes into being is the Immigration Restriction Act. Now, I'm just going to go through it with you because this White Australia policy dominates Australia and its behaviour in the world and migration policies right up until probably the 1960s, right? So for about the first 60 years of Australia, the White Australia policy dominates. Now, where's the... right. Now, I want you to look at this. So this here is the Immigration Restriction Act, 1901, an act to place certain restrictions on immigration and to provide for the removal from the Commonwealth of Australia of prohibited immigrants. And there's a few things that are listed. On the second page here it says who can come and migrate to Australia. I'm just going to go backwards. This one here is about labourers and things like that who under certain conditions can't come to Australia. F, any prostitute or person living off the prostitution of others can't come or migrate to Australia. E, any person who has been 3 years convicted of an offence. So if you've got a criminal conviction or history, you can't come. D, any person suffering from an infectious or contagious disease of a loathsome or dangerous character. There's a good word, loathsome. So basically, if you're sick, we've got an infection, you can't migrate to Australia. E, any idiot or insane person can't migrate to Australia. Now, I reckon that might cut a few of us out. I've been a bit of an idiot. That might cut me out. B, any person likely in the opinion of the minister or officer to become a charge upon the public. Basically, that means if you're going to have to rely on the government or charities for support, you can't come to Australia. Now, this first one, A, this is the really interesting one. Any person who, when asked to do so by an officer, fails to write out at dictation, sign in the presence of the officer a passage of 50 words in length in any European language directed by the officer. So this was known as the dictation test, and an immigration officer could give someone this and they would say, right, I want you to write out 50 words and they'd give them some text and the person would have to write that out in whatever language the migration officer told them to. And so you might, let's say it was me, I want to migrate to Australia, and the migration officer says to me, all right, I want you to write out 50 words of text in Hungarian. Now, I don't know Hungarian, so I'm not going to be able to write this dictation test out. So the officer then says to me, well, obviously you can't do this dictation test, so you can't migrate to Australia. And the question here is why? Why would an officer give someone this dictation test? And it was basically to keep out non-white people to Australia. So what's interesting here is it doesn't say anything about race, right? But everyone knew that's what the intent was. And so so people were given this dictation test, and if they failed, well, that's it, they couldn't migrate. What tended to happen was people who wanted to migrate to Australia who weren't from Britain or Western European countries, they didn't bother to migrate because they knew they'd be given this dictation test, right, and they would fail it. If the migration officer didn't like me, but I did know Hungarian and I wrote it out, he could give me another dictation test, say in Spanish. Let's say I knew Spanish, I could do that. He could keep giving me different languages to do it. So there was a Jewish political guy who knew quite a number of languages, and he kept passing the dictation test, kept passing. They didn't want him into Australia because of his politics at the time. And the one language that he did not know, so they were able to say, no, you can't come to Australia. The one language that he did not know was Gaelic. So Gaelic is a very old language spoken in some parts of Ireland and Scotland. So they used the dictation test with him to stop him because of his politics, not, well, at the time it was argued not because of his race. All right. So this is what we'll be looking at in week 2. Arthur Caldwell, Australian Minister of Immigration, 1945, said Australia wants and will welcome new healthy citizens who are determined to become good Australians. Down the bottom here it says beautiful bolts. Basically these women were from the Baltic countries in Eastern Europe, and they were basically the first non-British migrants to come, and the Australian government went all out to try and advertise how great it was to have these bolts. So even though they weren't necessarily from Britain, they looked British. So Arthur Caldwell was really trying to sell migration after World War II to Australia. So that's a little bit of an overview. Actually, just another couple of comments. After World War II, the reason we have people like the Bolts and things like that, from the Baltic states coming is Australia was worried after World War II that they would be threatened or with invasion from Asia because we had been fighting Japan. So this phrase came about, populate or perish. We had to populate Australia or Australia would perish. All right? And this is part of the argument, or part of the reason why we had massive migration after World War II. And what we find is Australia gets more migrants from Eastern Europe, such as the Baltic states, and from Italy and Greece. But it is not until after World War II, after the Vietnam War, when we get non-Europeans migrating to Australia. So at the end of the Vietnam War, we have a wave of Vietnamese and Cambodians migrating to Australia in the late 1970s and into the 1980s. Basically, the White Australia policy starts to be phased out in the 1960s into the 1970s, and it's officially ended in the early 1970s under the Whitlam government. All right, enough of me rambling on. All right, hope you haven't fallen asleep. You're still awake with me. All right, good on you. Just go and do some of those other exercises that's on the science page. Thanks for lasting. Stop snoring now. See ya.